Head Audio out of Germany has updated the Headphone 2 with this, the Headphone 2 GT, still using an AMT driver, but it's got a few things that are new. Let's talk about it.
Headphones. Phones for your head, made by HEDD.
Isn't it such a novel concept?
And before we get started, I should probably say, if you want a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at how these are actually made, in particular the AMT drivers, because that was surprisingly interesting, I took a visit to HEDD in Berlin a little while ago, and you can watch a video of that factory tour here.
Yeah, the guys there are actually really cool. They are really open to feedback, and I'm probably going to touch on this several points during this video, but they reach out fairly often asking how they can improve various things, whether it's ergonomics or aesthetics or sound or just anything across the board. They're always looking for feedback. They'll probably be reading the comments of this video too. Yeah,
it's really nice when manufacturers are like that, and both Dimitri and Freddie at HEDD have been fantastic every time I've gotten the chance to talk to them. Dimitri in particular, who's the main engineer behind this, as you say, he's super open to feedback, not just open to it, but actively seeking it as well, just to try and make better products wherever they can and get as much community opinion and input as possible. And I think, as we'll talk about with this, it's getting to a really good place.
Yeah. Now, that isn't to say that we don't have some criticisms, because we do, but also some things to praise. So how about we start off with building comfort, then we'll talk about subjective sound, and then objective sound, and show you guys all the juicy measurements.
Overall, this is pretty much identical in terms of exterior build to the original, well, Headphone 2, the original version of that, not the Headphone 1. That was quite different. But externally, you wouldn't really know that you were looking at a GT versus the actual Headphone 2 itself. What is quite different, though, is what happens when you take off the pads. And you'll be able to see that there is some interesting damping material in front of the driver in a few places, and that's part of how they've achieved this new tuning. It's not just changes to the driver itself, there are different physical damping changes inside the actual volume as well.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, aren't they the only people that are producing a headphone using an air motion transformer?
Yeah, so I think Goldplay now did one as well, although I've got to be honest, that one was not quite to my tastes anywhere near as much as either the Headphone 2 or the Headphone 2 GT were.
I'm remembering that now, and I think that's why it fell out of my memory.
Yeah, unfortunately, not great, that one. But other than that, yeah, I'm pretty sure these are the only guys doing an AMT in a headphone.
So build-wise, I guess there's a few things to note. First thing, and this is something that a lot of people are probably going to ask about, what are the size of these pads? So I've got my calipers here. They are about, let's see, about 46 millimeters wide, let's say 59 millimeters tall, and the depth of them, you'll notice it actually goes a little bit deeper than this piece of fabric right here. The fabric itself is 26 millimeters deep, but it can push in before you hit the driver to about 38 millimeters, so that is a pretty dang deep ear pad. I do find these to be just spacious enough for my ears as far as vertical and horizontal width is concerned, but then there's the rest of this headband design, which I think I have never seen anything like it before. I know you had some more comments on this also, given that the first one didn't fit your head and this one does.
Yeah, the original headphone I never really got to try properly because on the maximum adjustment it came down to about there, didn't really go all the way over my ears. I could never get a proper seal. Headphone 2 though, as part of the review, I kind of praised the headband design quite a bit because whilst there are some downsides, in particular the fact that it's not particularly quick to adjust, you actually have to take this one latch off there and then there's another one, but I think it's worth it because the reason that there are two is that one of these actually adjusts the size of the headband, so how much this pad here goes up, and the other one adjusts clamping force. This is one of the only headphones where you can actually adjust clamping force to a very significant degree, to the point where there's either almost none and it just floats on your head, or to the point where I can't even get it on my head because the clamping force is so tight. Having the ability to adjust clamp is awesome, and I'm more than willing to give up the ease of being able to adjust it just to get that. And personally, I do find the headband very comfortable. The main drawback that I have personally is actually where the headband attaches to the yokes. I find that these are a little bit stiff. They don't kind of swivel freely like you'd get on some other headphones, so once you put them on your head, they don't just sit into place. You do have to kind of twist them. So they do swivel, but you have to manually set it, if that makes sense, which is a little bit of a downside. Would have been nice if those were a little bit looser. But the actual headband itself, I really like the design of these.
On the subject of headbands, the carbon fiber is actually pretty dang light, and it feels strong too, which is nice considering the drivers themselves do have a pretty hefty amount of weight to them. Set this on my scale right here, and I get a hefty 570 grams with no cable attached. I will say, this feels lighter than a lot of headphones that I have worn in this weight range, but it is still not a light headphone by any means. This thing is hefty, but it is well managed heft. I think they did a good job with the headband and ergo. Outside of that, on the bottom, there is dual 3.5mm entry. Comes with a decent cable, nothing crazy, and it is compatible with other 3.5mm cables that I've tried around. There's also two sets of pads, one that are more of a sort of suede, and then the solid pads. Interesting thing, those pads don't change the sound. They're both basically the same, which is not what I expected. Basically, anytime I've ever tried a headphone where there's a pad swap option, the pads seem to completely change the sound. In this case, they don't, which is very rare. Now, I'm sure that if you put on a completely different pad of some kind, you'd probably get some sort of change, but in this case, both the pads that they ship with, they sound and measure the same.
I should note that I did actually get a very small change when I swapped the pads. These suede pads take down a little bit of a peak I get at 11 kilohertz slightly. It's not a huge difference, and I couldn't really notice any major changes anywhere else, as shown by the measurements. But I should probably note that in the upper treble, there was a very small change that I got from these suede pads. Although, to be honest, it could also just be something as simple as the pads being a slightly different shape, because the positional variation on these does seem to be slightly more notable than other headphones. So if your ear is a little bit more shifted forward or back in the front volume, that may affect things too.
Yes, it definitely does. On build, is there anything else you can think of before we get into sound?
I think the only other thing to note is I'm a much bigger fan of the cable that they've included this time than the previous one. It's a really nice soft braided cable, and it comes with various different adapters as well. So there's a single-ended cable, there is a balanced Pentagon cable, and they also include a nice adapter to XLR, so you can run this on pretty much anything you like with the accessories right out of the box.
That box itself has a lot of accessories in it.
It does. And this case is absolutely lovely. They did a good job on the case for the first one as well. So you can put the headphones in. There's a little separate compartment for any of your cables there. It's not exactly compact. As you can see, it's still pretty thick. It's not gonna slide in easily into luggage or anything, but in terms of just protecting the headphones and keeping your cables and stuff organized as well, it's a pretty nice case.
Should we jump into sound?
Let's do it.
So the first kind of thing I want to note on the HEDDphone 2 GT is sound-wise, it's a headphone that never had a wild wow moment for me, but also never left me feeling disappointed. And I think that's sort of an interesting middle ground to be in. It's kind of like the effect of what I got when the Focal Clear first came out, or when the Heidfman Aria first came out, which was like this is a headphone that's pretty good at doing most things, but also doesn't have one particular area where it stands out as like a whoa, that's incredible kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm usually more drawn to headphones like that, to be honest. I mean, I liked the Aria, I love the Susvara, not because they have a wow factor or sort of party trick. I mean, there are certain headphones like that which I really do like the 1266, for example, but generally I like a headphone that does everything pretty decently and isn't trying to just impress you with one particular trick that gets old after you've listened to about 4 or 5 songs. I think my overall summary on the HEDDphone 2 GT compared to the HEDDphone 2 is that out of the box, I think this sounds better than the HEDDphone 2. But if you are willing to EQ, I think the original HEDDphone 2 actually works better than this, because with a few tweaks, particularly to the bass, I think that you get a better overall response, whereas this has some improvements that make it much better out of the box, but then leave it a little bit harder to get just right with EQ.
I see what you're saying. Being a person who doesn't really love using a lot of EQ myself, I recognize the benefits of it, but I tend not to do it as much just because I swap between so many different computer systems and headphones. It just kind of adds a level of complexity for me. So I think without EQ, I prefer the GT. But I think that if you are a person using EQ, I can see where you're coming from with that.
Yeah. In particular, I think the bass is probably the biggest difference between the HEDDphone 2 and the HEDDphone 2 GT. The HEDDphone 2, one of the biggest complaints about it was that it had a roll-off into the sub-bass starting at, I think it was about 40 hertz. So it was a little bit lacking in the deepest bass region. But this is a lot flatter into the sub bass with quite a bit more mid bass on top. So this is a bassier sounding headphone overall, but it is fairly mid bass focused. And the interesting thing is that that's better than being bass light, I think, out of the box. But it also means that you can't just put a low frequency bass shelf on, or like when I was using the One GSC, I just put Impact Plus on and that's all I needed to do. And it doesn't quite work with this. Because if you have something which has a bass shelf in an analog, so if you're using an HM1 or if you're using something with tone controls, it's quite likely that that bass shelf's going to go up to about 80 hertz. And that means that as well as just bumping up the sub bass, you're bumping up and creating a bit of a peak in the mid bass. Whereas on the original one, you would just be left with pretty much a flat or slightly more mid bassy, but otherwise flat extension. And that just makes things a little bit trickier. You have to be a little bit more purposeful about it.
This one does also have a little bit more ear gain than the original Headphone 2 did. And tell me, we didn't really talk too much before this video about our different experiences, but tell me, how did you feel about dynamics on it? Because I don't know if it's just specifically the Air Motion driver or not, but I feel like these actually get decent dynamics.
I think so, yeah. I think, to be honest, that mid-bass lift does help to create a much bigger sensation of sort of punchiness, coupled with the fact that there is plenty of upper treble. The combination of those two things tends to help, because otherwise if you've got no treble, then it just gets woolly. If you've got no bass, then it's sharp, but with nothing to back it up, no body to it, as some might say. So these are punchy. These are pretty dynamic sounding headphones. I do definitely prefer once you tweak the sub bass to be a little bit more in line with the mid bass, but even just out of the box, the overall level of sort of engagement and fun factor is pretty excellent.
Yeah, I think that it's going to depend too on the genres you like a lot. For me, I think that this would be a really good headphone for people who love music mixed like old Fleetwood Mac. Like if you like the album Rumors, you'd probably really, really like the way it sounds on this AMT. If you like stuff like, I don't know, maybe really heavy EDM, you probably would be better looking in a different direction. But then again, you know, that might vary. I don't know. How do you feel about that? What do you like listening to on this? I mean, I like listening to electronic music, so that's definitely a genre which I tested a fair bit, and they do work. There's other headphones I think which would be better for that, but like a Meze Empyrean 2, for example, is something I'd probably take over these specifically for more electronic genres. These are definitely more detailed than those, though. I think that these, in terms of just resolution and overall technicalities, I think are superior. The main drawback with these, to be honest, actually, and the area where it doesn't work quite so well is, I would say, vocal timbre. The combination of the sort of slightly elevated 3 kilohertz region, and this is going to vary, which you'll see on the measurements in a sec, not just for one seating, but on different heads. Depending on the listener, you may get a bit of a dip around 4K and then a bit of a peak at 5K. I get more of a dip at 4K, and that means that the 5K peak is a little bit more evident and a little bit more bothersome, whereas other people, that may be a little bit flatter in profile overall, and so it might not be as much of an issue. For me, though, the combination of that sort of 3 kilohertz peak, a little bit of a dip to 4 kilohertz, then 5 kilohertz peak again, meant that vocal timbre on these was not particularly great. They came across a little bit shouty and etchy at times. Yeah, I would say that the timbre for like guitars and drums is way better than the timbre is for vocals on these. I feel like vocal timbre is kind of a weak point, but the flip side of that is that I feel like, especially more like kind of classic kind of guitar is a bit more articulated, a bit more natural than I get it on some other headphones. So it's kind of a weird trade-off.
Yeah, there's some stuff which works brilliantly.
How do you feel about imaging, soundstage, that kind of stuff?
Imaging precision I thought was pretty good. Playing the stereotypical test track Letters by Yoshi Horikawa, you can follow something left to right really easily. It doesn't have the sort of 3 blob effect that you get with, I get it quite badly on like the 600 series, for example. Soundstage overall kind of mirrors my thoughts on the Headphone 2, which is that they sound quite wide. I don't get much of a sense of frontal depth, though. So they sound wider than they do deep. So I wouldn't necessarily call them a big soundstage, but it is a wide soundstage.
Yeah, I don't get much depth either, but it does kind of separate a little bit out from the ear. It's almost like it kind of goes out from the ear a little bit and sits at a flat plane at a specified distance rather than being a deep field.
Yeah, that's kind of aligning what I'm getting as well.
So, which isn't an unpleasant sound. It does remind me a little bit of certain like kind of powered monitor speakers in the way that it presents itself. And I do think that it's also a headphone that is not afraid to, I don't know, I guess present some of more of the unpleasantries that can be in mixes in the upper mid range. So there are definitely some tracks that I've heard where they're a bit busy in the upper mid range, and you'll kind of hear that. It'll get a little bit more congested, but then all of the elements above that, especially in the upper trebles, sound so much more articulated that it's kind of a weird trade back and forth.
It's quite an interesting one, because I found that with busy mixes it tended to do really quite well. A lot of that being the fact that it's got a couple areas like that sort of 1 kilohertz area, it's a little bit bumped up, which this has been a bit consistent on a few headphones I've heard which do this, where that seems to give a bit of a better sense of kind of separation or contrast almost between like the vocals and the instruments that are playing simultaneously. It makes it less sort of hazy and muddled together, but at the expense of timbral accuracy slightly. So I didn't actually have too much issue with busier tracks overall. In fact, I actually thought that generally speaking, that's where it did better. Maybe less so with more low frequency dominated tracks, where you've got that slightly kind of mid-bass focus profile, less sub-bass, and the mid-bass is quite a bit higher than the mid-range itself.
I think it depends on the track too.
Yes, it's very track dependent. On a lot of stuff, I found that the sort of separation and ease of just focusing on one thing was really, really good. If it's got a lot of mid-bass content, it suddenly starts to slide back quite a bit. So it's very track dependent. But for a lot of stuff, and for I'd say most stuff, it was pretty good in that area. Yeah,
there's a couple tracks that I listened to where I really kind of noticed these standing out more is like Hey, Hi, How Are You by Kenya Grace, which is kind of like a D&B backing track with a female vocalist. That one sounded insanely good on these, as did the song Best Behavior by Mansionaire.
Oh, that's a good song.
Such a great song. I got a bit more congestion when the guitar came in on the track from the Arcane soundtrack, Heavy is the Crown, the one with Mike Shinoda in it. I loved that track, by the way. That's just an incredible track.
There's a lot of good tracks on the Arcane soundtrack. You should go listen to that if you haven't
really
done so already.
And that one sounded great, and then the guitars come in, and it's very full, but that one sounds a little bit congested. So yeah, I think it really just depends on the track and how it's mixed and how it's going to interact with that sort of air motion transformer timbre, you know?
I found that, to be honest, the thing I enjoyed listening to most on these was percussion heavy stuff. Percussion on these is energetic, fun, it's dynamic, it's really, really good. You don't need to worry about the timbre quite so much, but that sort of immediacy and the just the level of incisiveness that the upper treble has is really, really good. So Drums by Manacatcher, which is, as the name may imply, just drums. That sounds phenomenal on these, and I listen to that quite a bit. That's definitely one that's worth trying if you have a chance to listen to these.
Yeah, another one actually on that same train of thought is a track called Wood and Skin by, I don't know if I pronounce this right, Hara Noda. And it's a song of just one drum set, and it sounds so good on these. Like, it sounds punchy, sounds roomy, alive. Yeah, I'll send you a link to it. So I think we covered subjective sound pretty good. What do you say we get into measurements, frequency response, all the objective stuff?
Yeah, let's do it.
But before we show you the graph, real quick, I want to give a mention to headphones.com, because that's what makes these videos possible. They have insane 365-day long returns, which is kind of wild, and really, really good customer support. You can check them out at the link in the video description.
I think actually I'm really glad that we have not just the measurements but the HPTF variation results for this headphone, because this is a headphone where, depending on the listener, some of those timbral quirks that we described could be almost non-existent for some people and quite prominent for some people. I unfortunately fall a little bit further along the line of it being more prominent, but for other people, just based on this graph, we can see that that's not going to be the case. So the thing that I'm going to call out first is if you look between the region of about 3 kilohertz and 5 kilohertz, that dip or the area at around 4 kilohertz varies quite a lot from listener to listener. And that means that for people who happen to fall on the range where this headphone interacting with their head is going to be at the higher end of that, the timbre is probably going to be overall quite a bit considerably better. It's a more even response throughout that whole 3 to 5K region. Whereas for someone like me, where unfortunately I'm much more on the I've got a big dip there, it means that it emphasizes the 3 and 5 kilohertz peaks a little bit. And it's interesting to see just how much that changes from listener to listener, and how in this particular instance, I don't think the single measurement result would ever tell the full story.
Yeah, which, by the way, if you're not familiar with HPTF, this is basically a colored in area showing the variation from ear to ear. So we test on multiple different ears and then compensate those measurements to the head-related transfer function of those ears, and that kind of gives us this range of how much the headphone will vary from person to person. Should we go through this just from left to right?
Yeah, let's do it.
So you can see it does still have decent sub bass. The sub bass is basically at the same level as the mid-range is here. We have that elevation that starts around, say, 55, 60 hertz. It starts to bump up a little bit. That does bleed a little bit into the low mid-range, and just kind of constantly downslope until about 900 hertz, probably 800 hertz. Then, depending on your ear, it's either going to bump up a little bit or it's going to bump up a lot more, right in that range from about 1 kilohertz to 1.8 kilohertz. Things close in a bit more around 2.2K, and then we kind of start to go back and forth. So maybe you'll get a bit of a dip here at 4K, or maybe you won't. Just about everyone sees the same elevation-ish around 5 kilohertz. We start to dip a little bit back down, and then we see some elevation right above 10K. And this seems like one that's more noticeable on some people than others. You see on the low end of the HPTF, it's just at the edge of the average listener preference bounds, but on the high end, it goes up quite a fair bit. So it's really going to vary depending on your ear shape, what you're going to get there. And then from there, you will potentially get really good treble extension, or maybe you'll get a bit darker upper treble above that. Again, it really depends on your ear shape, and it just goes to show how much some drivers are going to have completely different HPTF effects.
Yeah, so this is a headphone which is going to have quite significantly different pros and cons for different people. The nice thing about this graph is it shows us that people are going to have very different experiences. There's the sort of 2 to 5 kilohertz area that I described a minute ago. That peak, which you just talked about, is also one which, unfortunately for me, is quite present, whereas I think you said it wasn't as significant for you.
Yeah, and I mean, well, I'm sure you've seen, I did a video recently about the Bayer Dynamic DT 1990 Mark II, and there were people complaining in there saying, oh, you're treble sensitive, but this peak doesn't bother me. So yeah, it's going to really depend on your head shape.
Well, that's the thing. It's not just a case of preference, it's a case of it may genuinely not be there for you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've done a measurement. I don't have it on me at this exact moment, but I also did a measurement of these with in-ear mics, and it gets a pretty consistent result to most of the frequency response that we see here, with the exception that I don't have that peak at 10 kilohertz on my in-ear mics.
Nice.
Which leads me to my next point about these, which is if you're looking at buying these, you should try them. You should try them. Go to a Can Jam, go to something like that, because you might really like them, or you might not. But the best way to find out is to try them.
It's definitely worth trying, if anything, just because of the variation that we've seen here. I think my overall summary on these is that if you are not wanting to use EQ whatsoever, this is definitely a better out-of-the-box experience than the original Headphone 2. Whether or not this is the right choice for you kind of depends on what genres you listen to. There's a lot of stuff which I would absolutely reach for these over pretty much anything else, and then there's a lot of stuff where I would kind of avoid listening to these. I wouldn't say that these are an excellent all-rounder, but if you mostly listen to a lot of electronic music, I actually do think that these are really, really good. The sort of level of what some might describe as speed, even though it's mostly just upper treble extension, for me was absolutely top notch. That mid-bass profile makes things sound really, really punchy. And to be honest, a lot of electronic music actually benefits from a slightly more mid-bass focused profile. A lot of the time it's produced on stuff where there isn't much sub-bass in the monitors that they're using anyway. If you are happy to use EQ though, this is the big thing. I think you should get the original Headphone 2, because the original Headphone 2, you can just add a bit of a sub-bass lift, and then the treble profile for me was significantly better just out of the box. I didn't really feel the need to do anything to it. Maybe you can bump it up a little bit just because it was a bit dark, but in terms of the shape, the peaks and dips and stuff, that was really, really good on my head. It was just the sub-bass, and I could just turn up a little bit of a bass boost, and it was fine. So if you're willing to use EQ, I think that you can get a better result with the Headphone 2. If you don't want to use EQ, I think that the Headphone 2 GT is a better out-of-the-box experience.
That's a good way to put it, yeah, because the original was a little bit dark for me. And, myself, Resolve, some others, we've given feedback to the guys over at HEDD. And my main thing, if I had to say anything about it, was I would love for it to be a little bit lighter, and I would also love for just the overall response to be a bit more linear, just show a bit less variation across the board. But other than that, it's pretty solid.
It is a pretty solid headphone. I really love the construction of it. I know you think it's a little too heavy. It is a little heavy. I don't mind it so much just because this headband and the clamp adjustment means that I can get it super comfortable on my head anyway. To be honest, the main thing that I would say I'd love to see change just in terms of the build would be making the pad actual cutout a little bit bigger, although there's obviously the risk that that would change sound, so maybe that's not possible. And yeah, in terms of sound, I think having it a little bit more linear, particularly from sort of 1 to 5K, like the Headphone 2 was, would be ideal. But other than that, it is really a pretty solid headphone. It's just quite genre specific.
One last thing I think we should probably mention is power. It's not like an easy to drive headphone, but it's also not a hard to drive headphone. It's in that weird perfect position where if I'm using it with the Asgard 3, I have to turn it up a little bit too high for low gain, but high gain is a little bit too loud for it, so I end up using high gain on very low volume.
Right.
So it's very much right in a middle zone between like a hard to power headphone and an easy to power headphone, which, you know, you're going to have to use an amp with it. I think almost any amp is going to drive it just fine, so I wouldn't worry too much about that, but you're definitely not going to get away with just plugging it into a MacBook.
No, we'll have some numbers on the screen now showing how much power this actually needs to get up to 110 dB peaks, just to make sure that you are absolutely covered, even if you are playing Billie Eilish with a bass boost at quite loud volumes. I think overall, yeah, what you said, you need an amp for sure. You can't just plug this directly into your phone or PC or something. You don't really need any particular amp. It will run happily off pretty much anything that's got some level of power. There was the Apple dongle, I would say, the EU variant anyway, could not get this loud enough, but everything else I've had drives these without too much issue.
Yeah, I used these on the Quest Style M15 over 4.4, and it was great. I used it on the Cord Mojo too, and that was absolutely fine. Just most amps will get the job done. So, final conclusions. HEDD 2 GT, I feel like we pretty much agree on it. It's a headphone that, across the board, it seems like a headphone that's pretty decent. It does have some shortcomings, but I don't think those stop it from being just a good headphone in general. It's going to vary a lot from person to person depending on your ear shape, what kind of response that gives you at the eardrum. I definitely think it's worth trying. And like Cameron said, if you're someone who really wants to use EQ, use EQ regularly, you might want to check out the original Headphone 2. But if you don't, then the GT is probably better out of the box.
If you're interested in a Headphone 2 or Headphone 2 GT, they are available at headphones.com with a 365-day return policy. And I hope you enjoyed that video and found it useful. If you've got any questions that you wanted to ask about the headphone, other headphones, amps, DACs, music, or gear, come and say hey on the headphones.com Discord server or the headphones.com forum, where I, Douglas, and other wiggly air enthusiasts will endeavor to help. Until next time, thanks for watching.